What's up, guys? Matthew here. Today, we are going to look at the biggest idiots who died in horrific ways on Everest. From a gym owner who froze alive on a ladder in the Khumbu icefall, to a hedge fund manager who lost everything 200 feet from a summit he never reached, which, let me warn you, is the most pointless yet most horrifying climb I've seen. It was April 22nd, 2013, and the pre-dawn darkness over the Khumbu icefall held temperatures around -12 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was still, the kind of stillness that experienced climbers distrusted because it meant the mountain was waiting. Above base camp, the icefall rose in a frozen cascade of house-sized seracs and bottomless crevasses, its architecture shifting invisibly as the Khumbu Glacier inched downhill beneath it. Aluminum ladders lashed together with ropes spanned the widest gaps, their rungs glazed with ice. Fixed ropes threaded through the chaos, anchored to ice screws the icefall doctors had placed days earlier. Taggart Slade moved through the lower icefall with the confidence of someone who had never been humbled by a mountain. He was 29, an American from Scottsdale, Arizona, who owned a CrossFit gym that funded what he called his ultimate fitness test. Taggart had the physique of someone who trained 6 hours a day, broad shoulders, visible vascularity, even through base layers, and a resting heart rate he quoted to anyone within earshot. He had climbed Kilimanjaro the previous year on a guided trek requiring no technical skill. That single experience had convinced him that mountaineering was an athletic contest, and he was the most athletic person on the mountain. His expedition company had accepted him based on a fitness assessment and a resume listing gym accomplishments, where climbing credentials should have been. At base camp, Taggart had made himself conspicuous, doing pull-ups from tent frames, comparing recovery metrics with other climbers over meals, and offering unsolicited training advice to teammates who had been climbing for decades. The confidence was genuine. That was the problem. And I'll be honest, when I first went through the details of his application and matched it against what the icefall actually demands, I couldn't figure out how anyone looked at that resume and said yes. Taggart had never worn crampons on actual ice before arriving at base camp. His first ladder crossing during practice had made his assigned Sherpa, Nima Thendup, visibly uncomfortable. Nima was 41, a veteran of 14 icefall crossings, who had lost a cousin to a serac collapse on this same route in 2012. He had watched Taggart grip the fixed lines with his hands rather than trusting his crampons to the rungs, muscling across gaps that required balance, not strength. Nima communicated to the expedition leader that the client was not ready. Taggart declined a second practice session, stating he had the movement dialed. He said he had the movement dialed, despite being a man who had never stood on glacier ice before that week. I honestly sat with that for a while, not knowing how to react. On this second rotation, the route was crowded. A bottleneck had formed at a junction where 2 ladder crossings met at a serac platform, barely wide enough for 4 people. Teams from 3 expeditions were stacked on the fixed lines. Radio traffic between the icefall and base camp crackled with status updates and requests for spacing. They reached the crux crossing at approximately 4:40 a.m., a 3-ladder span over a crevasse that dropped into darkness beyond any headlamp's reach. Taggart clipped his Jumar and safety carabiner to the fixed line and stepped out. He made it 6 rungs before the ladder flexed under his weight. He overcorrected, planting his crampon too far left. The front points scraped metal instead of hooking. He grabbed the handline with both fists, but his legs dangled free. The ladder swung sideways. Nima called instructions immediately. Find the rung with his right foot, weight it slowly, stand. But Taggart was gripping the rope so tightly, his arms trembled, crampons kicking at empty air. His Jumar held him to the fixed line, but the position was untenable. Suspended half off the ladder, with no ability to regain the rungs without trusting his feet. The one skill he had never developed. The strongest climber on the mountain, physically, and the thing killing him was a simple weight transfer that any first-season mountaineer could do in their sleep. That irony hasn't left me. The bottleneck grew. 12 climbers stacked on the fixed ropes in a zone where standing still meant standing beneath seracs that could calve without warning. Time in the icefall was measured in exposure. Nima began working out onto the ladder from the far side, intending to guide Taggart's feet back to the rungs. The serac released at 5:02 a.m., not the collapse of an entire tower. A lateral shift in a wall of ice 40 feet above that sent refrigerator-sized blocks cascading down the corridor. The sound arrived first, a deep cracking report that echoed off the surrounding ice walls. Nima threw himself flat and hooked his arms through the rungs. Taggart, still suspended by his Jumar, had no protection. The collapse slammed through their section in under 3 seconds. When the ice settled, Nemo was alive, bleeding from a gash on his forearms. Taggart and 2 sections of ladder had been swept into the crevasse below. His Jumar was found still attached to the fixed rope, the carabiner gate sheared open by falling ice. Recovery teams determined retrieval was not possible. Taggart Slade was 29 years old. He had been on Everest for 18 days and had never learned to walk on a ladder. It was May 19th, 2017, on the summit ridge of Mount Everest. The death zone stretched above 26,000 feet, where freezing winds and thin air made every step a struggle. Climbers relied entirely on supplemental oxygen and careful pacing to survive. Even minor equipment failures could be fatal. Visibility was limited, the terrain exposed, and the slightest misstep carried the risk of a deadly fall. Jenkin Adara, 38, a firefighter from Denver, had been climbing with Paul Hendricks for 8 years. He had recently inherited $200,000 from his father and had loaned Hendricks $75,000 to fund his Everest expedition. After Hendricks's business failed, Adara had pressed Hendricks repeatedly for repayment, even threatening legal action when Hendricks claimed he could not pay. Though they had climbed together for years, Adara confided to other climbers that he no longer trusted Hendricks with financial or life-critical matters and planned to end their climbing partnership after Everest. Paul Hendricks, 36, had grown increasingly bitter. He felt humiliated by the constant pressure to repay the loan and resented Adara's authority. According to this fictional account, Hendricks studied oxygen systems extensively and learned exactly how to create a slow leak that would appear accidental. Climbers later recalled Hendricks asking unusual questions about regulator mechanics and Adara's insurance policies. The night before the summit push, Adara's Sherpa guide noticed Hendricks handling Adara's oxygen gear, assuming he was helping, unaware that Hendricks was sabotaging it. During the early morning ascent toward the summit, Adara's primary oxygen regulator began losing pressure unexpectedly. At first, he noticed subtle drops in flow, causing mild shortness of breath. He adjusted the mask and switched between regulators, but the supply continued to dwindle far faster than anticipated. Each step became heavier and his movements slower as the lack of oxygen began to sap both strength and coordination. About 300 feet below the peak, the regulator fully failed, leaving Adara gasping for air on the narrow ridge. His vision blurred, his balance faltered, and severe altitude sickness set in. Confusion, staggering, and sharp headaches made even basic steps dangerous. Hendricks claimed his own system was malfunctioning and refused to share oxygen, despite having full bottles, leaving Adara isolated in the most critical section of the climb. Every attempt to descend became more treacherous, the sheer drops on either side offering no margin for error. Within minutes, Adara's condition worsened dramatically. Cerebral edema overwhelmed him, clouding judgment and causing him to stumble repeatedly. Disoriented and slipping on the icy ridge, he could no longer maintain his footing. Hendricks's helmet camera later showed him checking Adara's pulse, confirming the unconsciousness. Before he continued alone toward the summit, Adara collapsed on the ridge, just 280 feet from the top, the thin air and freezing temperatures ensuring that survival was impossible. Hendricks radioed base camp later, reporting that Adara had succumbed to altitude sickness, and no rescue was attempted due to location and weather. Adara's body was recovered 6 weeks later during a commercial expedition. The coroner listed cerebral edema and hypoxia as the cause of death, but the damaged regulator was noted as a contributing factor. Tool marks on the valve indicated deliberate puncture, inconsistent with accidental damage or normal wear. Hendricks collected Adara's life insurance payout as the designated beneficiary and never repaid the loan. Official reports briefly listed the death as high-altitude cerebral edema near the summit, with no mention of foul play. Among climbers, the story circulated as a chilling example of revenge at extreme altitude, one partner eliminating another when resentment and greed outweighed loyalty, and the mountain left no room for mercy. It was May 19th, 2016. The south col of Mount Everest sits at 26,000 feet, and if you've never heard of it, it's basically the last camp before the summit. A flat, wind-blasted plateau where the air has about a third of the oxygen you'd breathe at sea level. That morning the sky was clear, temperatures around -22 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill, dragging it even lower. The summit was visible from camp, and I know that sounds like a good sign. It really wasn't. So here's who Derek Savelle was. 31 years old, wellness creator, the kind of person who built an audience by doing hard things and filming them. Cold plunges, extended fasts, high altitude hikes. The whole brand was built around the idea that discomfort is a choice, and most people just aren't willing to push through it. Everest was supposed to be the proof. The ultimate episode. She had summited two 6,000-meter peaks before this, which sounds like solid experience. Until you realize the death zone on Everest starts right around where those mountains top out. She joined a commercial expedition as a paying client, showed up with her gear, her camera, and a summit speech she had written and rehearsed for weeks. A scripted speech. Who does that and genuinely thinks it's going to go fine? Now, before we get into what happened, you need to understand something about the death zone. Above 26,000 feet, your body is not maintaining, it is declining. Every minute you spend up there, especially standing still, your core temperature drops, your oxygen saturation drops, your ability to think clearly drops. It's not dramatic, it's just math. And because of that math, guided expeditions set a hard turnaround time, usually between 1 and 2 p.m. No exceptions, no negotiations, regardless of whether you've hit the summit or not. The mountain doesn't care how close you are. Miss that window and you are not getting down safely. That's just how it works. Darixa was already behind schedule before she even got to the hard part. Her Sherpa clocked it at the balcony, 27,600 feet, where she was running about 40 minutes slower than she needed to be. She reached the south summit sometime around midday, just barely inside the window, and right there her Sherpa gave her the options. Push straight to the true summit or turn around. What she could not do, what the situation physically would not allow, was stop and film. So she stopped and filmed. First take, wind noise. Second take, her buff was sitting wrong across her face. She fixed it, reviewed the footage on her camera screen, reset, went again. Her Sherpa warned her. She kept going. Warned her a second time. She kept going. By take 11, she was finally happy with it. Which makes me wonder, what exactly is going through your head on take 9? Take 10? At 28,700 feet, what are you telling yourself? She reached the true summit well past the cutoff. The time-stamped footage later confirmed she had burned through nearly an hour and a half at the south summit alone. The descent started immediately, but her body had already been losing the battle the entire time she was standing still in the cold running takes. By the Hillary step, she was stumbling on the fixed ropes. Her Sherpa was getting single-word answers to questions. Not a good sign at any altitude. Genuinely terrifying at this one. Not long after, she sat down on the ridge just below the step. Her Sherpa tried to get her back up, tried to physically support her and move her, but one person cannot carry a non-ambulatory adult at 28,000 feet. It's just not physically possible up there. She lost consciousness roughly 30 minutes after sitting down. No fall, no sudden event. She sat down, and that was it. I think if she had turned around at take 3, even take 5, we're probably not talking about her right now. The Sherpa radioed base camp shortly after she became unresponsive. A second Sherpa was sent up from Camp 4 but didn't reach her before dark. Helicopter rescue above 26,000 feet isn't viable. There's nothing anyone could do from the outside. Every option had already closed. The recovery team reached her the next morning and found her exactly where she had stopped. Still seated, still leaning against the ridge. The mountain had just held her there overnight. Recovery wasn't attempted given the location and conditions. Her camera was pulled from her jacket on site. Memory card intact. All 11 takes of the summit speech were on it, along with time-stamped footage that confirmed exactly how long she had been standing still at the south summit. That timestamp laid out the entire sequence without a single word needing to be said. Her death was ruled hypothermia, secondary to prolonged exposure above 28,000 feet. Delayed descent and physical exhaustion were listed as contributing factors. The expedition's incident report noted the turnaround advisory had been given twice and declined both times. The case was closed. Darixa came to Everest to get the perfect take. 11 tries in, she got it. She just never got to use it. It was May 17, 2016, and the pre-dawn cold at Camp 3 on the Lhotse face held at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp clung to a narrow shelf chopped into the ice at 23,500 feet. Tents anchored by screws driven into blue ice that creaked under thermal stress. Stacy Lusk was 44, from Scottsdale, Arizona, a real estate executive with a legitimate climbing resume. Denali, Aconcagua, multiple Himalayan trekking peaks. She had planned to climb Everest, but missed the permit deadline and lost her guiding slot. She took a discounted Lhotse position instead, accepted on paper, never intended to climb Lhotse. Her climbing Sherpa was Pemba Chotar, 33, with 7 Lhotse summits and 4 on Everest. Small in stature, but his endurance at altitude was something bigger climbers couldn't match. Throughout the expedition, Stacy kept asking detailed questions about the Everest route, where it split from Lhotse, how the ropes were set up above Camp 3, what the traverse across the yellow band looked like. Pemba figured she was just curious. Other Sherpas later called it reconnaissance. I'll be real, when I was putting this story together, the reconnaissance part caught me off guard. This wasn't impulsive. She spent weeks gathering intel on a route she was never supposed to be on. On summit push morning, team climbed above Camp 3 in the dark, at around 24,500 feet, where the Lhotse route continued straight, while the Everest route cut left toward the Geneva Spur. Stacy unclipped from the Lhotse line and clipped onto the Everest traverse rope. Pemba called out right away. She waved him off and kept moving. He followed and told her straight. Her permit was for Lhotse. She had no oxygen cached on the Everest route. No Sherpa support above this point. She'd be arrested on descent. Stacy told him the permit system was a money grab, and she was already past the point of turning back. She called it a money grab. I need you to sit with that. The permit system exists because people die on this mountain every single year, and the woman calling it a scam is about to prove exactly why it exists. Pemba radioed base camp. Every response said the same thing: get her off the route. He blocked the fixed rope at the yellow band and laid out the math. Her oxygen was calculated for a Lhotse summit, not the extra hours Everest would take. Without supply cached above, she'd run out. Stacy pushed past him. Pemba refused to follow. He unclipped from the Everest rope and went back down to the Lhotse line. Stacy was alone on the Everest route, above 25,000 feet. She made it to around 26,200 feet on the Geneva Spur before the oxygen math became undeniable. She turned around, but she'd been above 24,500 feet for hours longer than planned, exhausted, hypoxic, moving through terrain she'd never seen before. On the traverse back, she missed a clip-in point on an exposed section of rope. She tumbled several hundred feet down the face before coming to rest against broken ice. A Sherpa team found her the next morning. Pemba Chotar was questioned by authorities for 2 days. His answers never changed. He warned her, blocked her, radioed for support, and refused to enable the decision. He was cleared, but other Sherpas said he was quieter after that season. 2 days of questioning for a man who did everything right. That part genuinely made me angry. He warned her, he blocked the rope, he called it in, and he still had to sit in a room and justify himself. It was May 12, 2016, and the western CWM stretched for miles between base camp and the Lhotse face, a broad glacial valley that became a solar oven by mid-morning. Temperatures started near 10 degrees Fahrenheit and climbed past 40 in direct sun, accelerating dehydration at 20,000 feet. Patrick Morgan, 52, from Boston, had spent 26 years as a corporate attorney before retiring to pursue deferred life experiences. He approached Everest with methodical preparation, personal trainer, expedition accounts, contingency plans, and hundreds of hours of online research he treated as equivalent to field experience. His climbing experience consisted of Rainier and Aconcagua. He paid $71,000 to a well-regarded Western operator. His Sherpa was Norden Furba, 38, from Pangboch, 9 Everest summits. Respected for reading weather and managing clients who confused determination with capability. He supported his wife, 2 children, and his brother's widow and her children. Patrick's defining characteristic was legalistic thinking. He treated protocols as contractual obligations. During the first briefing, when expedition leader Robert Kelvin explained the summit attempts could be canceled based on weather or client condition, Patrick asked what metrics would trigger that decision and whether it could be appealed. Kelvin explained that guiding required judgment that could not be reduced to checklists. Patrick responded that his $71,000 payment contractually entitled him to a summit attempt barring extraordinary circumstances. Through rotations, the pattern intensified. When Norden recommended an extra rest day at Camp 2 because his saturation read 73%, Patrick argued the measurement fell within acceptable parameters, based on ranges he had found in online climbing forums, and that delaying without medical necessity violated the expedition's duty. When Kelvin supported Norden's recommendation, Patrick complied, but made clear he considered it overly conservative. The critical failure occurred during the final rotation to Camp 3. Patrick developed a persistent headache and nausea at 21,000 feet. Norden recognized inadequate acclimatization and recommended immediate descent. Patrick refused, citing the timeline and pointing out others with similar symptoms had continued. He produced printed pages from a medical journal discussing difficulty distinguishing altitude sickness from dehydration. Norden explained his assessment came from 16 years of watching clients deteriorate. Patrick dismissed this as anecdotal evidence. He climbed to Camp 3 against explicit recommendation. By 23,500 feet, he fumbled simple tasks and moved with unsteady gait, signaling cerebral edema. Norden checked his saturation, 68%. He told Patrick he needed immediate descent or risked cerebral swelling, progressing to coma within hours. Patrick insisted he would rest overnight and reassess. The following morning, Patrick was found unresponsive in his tent. The cerebral edema had progressed overnight until consciousness became impossible. Norden and two Sherpas began emergency descent, carrying and lowering him through technical Lhotse face terrain. Patrick Morgan died during descent at approximately 22,800 feet. Norden sustained severe lower back injury during evacuation. Hauling dead weight down 45-degree ice hyperextended his spine and herniated 2 discs. Surgery provided partial relief, but chronic pain ended his ability to work above Camp 2. He retired from expedition work at 39. It was May 19, 2014. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Camp 4 sat at 26,000 feet in the death zone, where climbers made their final preparations before summit attempts during narrow weather windows. Lorraine Vasquez was 45 years old, a dental hygienist from Portland, Oregon. She had paid significant money for a commercial expedition package with a well-known guiding company. Her climbing experience was limited to guided trips on lower altitude peaks. She had trained for over a year, but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime achievement and had made the expedition a central part of her identity for the past year. Everest's summit push from the South Col required climbers to ascend over 3,000 feet through the death zone, where the human body deteriorates rapidly due to oxygen deprivation. The standard protocol involved leaving Camp 4 around midnight to reach the summit by mid-morning and descend before afternoon weather deteriorated. Turnaround times were strictly enforced regardless of summit success. Climbers who stayed too long at altitude risked exhaustion, disorientation, and being caught descending in darkness. The descent was statistically more dangerous than the ascent, requiring full concentration and remaining in energy reserves. The expedition leader conducted a briefing at Camp 4 the evening before the summit push. He emphasized the turnaround time of 1 p.m., regardless of position on the mountain. Lorraine made a dismissive comment about having come too far to turn back early, and that she hadn't paid this much money to follow arbitrary time limits. Lorraine reached the summit at 12:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the turnaround time. The guide said they needed to begin descending. Lorraine pulled out her phone and camera. She began taking photos and videos. The guide reminded her of the turnaround time. Lorraine said she needed more time after everything she had been through. The guide explained they needed to leave immediately to descend safely before dark. Lorraine argued that 15 minutes wouldn't matter. She continued taking photos from different angles. Other climbers from different expeditions were also on the summit, creating congestion. The guide's voice became firm as he stated they were leaving now. Lorraine responded that she had paid for this experience and deserved time to enjoy it. She mentioned the money she had invested and said she would leave negative reviews if she was rushed. By the time Lorraine agreed to descend, over half an hour had passed. The guide was visibly concerned as they began the descent. The route down was slow due to other climbers. By the time they reached the south summit, Lorraine's pace had slowed noticeably. The guide stayed close to her, monitoring her condition. As they descended further, Lorraine began stopping more frequently. Her movements became sluggish. The guide asked if she was okay. She said she was just tired. By late afternoon, they were still well above safe elevation. Daylight was fading. The guide radioed for additional support. Lorraine sat down on the snow and said she needed to rest. The guide tried to get her moving, explaining that stopping in the death zone was dangerous. Lorraine's responses became slower and less coherent. She was showing signs of severe exhaustion and altitude effects. The guide attempted to help her stand, but she couldn't maintain her balance. Her oxygen supply was running low. The guide shared his oxygen with her, but his own supply was also limited. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped further. Another guide from a different expedition reached their position and assisted. They tried to move Lorraine downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She slumped against the slope. Her breathing became shallow. The guides continued efforts to revive her and move her, but she became unresponsive. Despite continued rescue efforts through the night, she did not regain consciousness. Her body was found the next morning by a descending team, located on the route above the balcony where she had collapsed. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from exhaustion and exposure in the death zone, complicated by altitude effects and oxygen depletion. The extended time at extreme altitude, combined with the physical demands of the climb and descent, had depleted her body's reserves. The delay in beginning the descent had left insufficient time and energy to reach safety before darkness and extreme cold set in. Evidence, including radio communications and witness statements, established that she had exceeded the turnaround time and spent excessive time on the summit despite warnings. The death was ruled accidental. It was April 29, 2016, and the western CWM stretched ahead in blinding white light. The sun's radiation, amplified by the ice walls of Nuptse and Everest's southwest face, pushed air temperatures to nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit at 21,000 feet. Wan markers traced the route across the glacier, thin bamboo sticks marking the tested path between hidden crevasses beneath snow bridges weakened by afternoon warmth. Abandoned oxygen bottles and shredded tent fabric from previous seasons lay partially buried along the route margins. Allegra Fontaine was 34, a French-Canadian from Montreal with 90,000 social media followers and a motivational podcast averaging 12,000 downloads per episode. The Everest expedition was content, a narrative arc culminating in summit footage that would cement her brand. Her actual experience consisted of indoor gym sessions and a single guided attempt on Mont Blanc, abandoned at the Guder Hut when weather closed. She had never spent a night above 10,000 feet. To secure her spot, she submitted a resume listing climbs she had never completed. The budget operator, running its second Everest season, never verified the claims. When I traced back her application and compared it to what she'd actually climbed, every single line was either inflated or invented, and the company cashed the check without a phone call. Her Sherpa, Furba Sonam, was 28, assigned because the operator's experienced Sherpas had been allocated elsewhere. Furba had summited twice with solid technical skills, but lacked the seniority to push back effectively. During Allegra's safety briefing, she had spent the session filming herself nodding along. When Furba reviewed rope protocol individually, she assured him she understood with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to performing competence rather than possessing it. That distinction, performing competence versus possessing it, is something I've been thinking about since I started covering these stories, and Allegra might be the purest example I've come across. On this acclimatization rotation toward Camp 2, the team moved across the CWM on fixed lines. The route was straightforward but treacherous, flat terrain concealing crevasses beneath thin snow crusts. At approximately 11:20 a.m., the group paused where the route bent around a visible crevasse. Several teams rested in the same area, offering the backdrop Allegra's content required. She told Furba she needed a photo and unclipped from the fixed line. Furba immediately told her to clip back in. She waved him off and stepped 15 feet off the wand route. The snow bridge collapsed without sound. One moment, she was standing with her phone raised. The next, the ground opened and she dropped into a crevasse, invisible from the surface. Furba was at the edge within seconds. Allegra had fallen roughly 30 feet before wedging between the narrowing walls. She was conscious, reporting she could not feel her legs. The impact had damaged her spine. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below zero, her body losing heat through contact with the ice walls. 15 feet off the marked route, that's all it took. I measured it against other crevasse incidents on the CWM, and the number is almost always the same: 10, 15, 20 feet. The mountain doesn't need you to wander far. Furba anchored to the fixed line and radioed for assistance. Within 20 minutes, climbers and Sherpas from 2 other expeditions arrived with rope and hardware. They set ice screws along the crevasse lip, equalized anchors, and lowered Furba into the slot. The walls narrowed as he descended, forcing him sideways past constrictions of glacial ice that groaned under the glacier's own weight. He reached Allegra where the walls were barely shoulder-width apart. She was semi-conscious, her skin waxy, breathing shallow. While threading webbing beneath her arms, a section of the crevasse wall shifted, slow grinding as the glacier adjusted its pressures. The shift pinned and twisted Furba's lower right leg against the opposite wall, crushing bone. He kept working through the pain, secured the webbing, and signaled the surface team to haul. His ankle is being crushed, and he finishes rigging the harness before he signals for help. I need you to hold that image when I tell you what happened to his career. The Z-pulley extraction took 45 minutes. Allegra was brought to the surface, unresponsive. Furba followed, unable to bear weight. Radio coordination with base camp confirmed what the rescuers knew. She needed evacuation the CWM could not reliably provide. The team began carrying her toward a staging point for potential helicopter extraction. Allegra Fontaine died during the carry. Spinal trauma, hypothermia, and internal injuries had overwhelmed her body. She was 34. Her phone, recovered from a crevasse ledge, contained the photo she had framed but never taken. Furba Sonam was evacuated to Kathmandu, where surgeons rebuilt his ankle with pins and plates. The damage was permanent. He would walk again, but never climb. At 28, his Everest career was over, ended in a crevasse he entered to save someone who should never have been on the mountain. He returned to his village in Farak and took work managing a tea house on the trekking route to base camp. 28 years old, running a tea house. Because a woman who had never slept above 10,000 feet unclipped from a rope for a photograph. I've covered a lot of these stories, and the cost always seems to land on the person who did everything right. On November 14th, 2015, climbers were high on the Lhotse face of Mount Everest, moving across a steep wall of hardened blue ice. Fixed ropes were their only protection against a catastrophic fall as freezing temperatures and strong winds swept the slope. At that altitude, thin air made even simple movements physically demanding. Clyden Bolton, 34, was attempting his first 8,000-meter peak after years of preparation. A petroleum engineer from Houston, he had spent 3 years training and approximately $85,000 on permits, logistics, and prior climbs. He had summited Denali and Aconcagua and was regarded within his team as careful and methodical. Bolton kept a detailed expedition journal, recording rope conditions, oxygen use, and turnaround times. Since arriving at base camp, he had been in open conflict with expedition leader Viktor Kozlov over safety margins and weather timing. Bolton argued that the forecast window was marginal and that sections of the fixed line above Camp 3 required replacement. He told teammates that if the expedition continued to ignore safety protocols, he would formally report the violations after returning from the mountain. Kozlov, a veteran leader with multiple Everest seasons, viewed Bolton's challenges as a direct threat to his reputation and livelihood. Several climbers later recalled tense exchanges between the two men in camp, with arguments escalating as summit day approached. On the night of November 13th, voices were heard outside tents at Camp 3. Bolton's assigned Sherpa declined to continue upward the next morning, stating he was uncomfortable with the atmosphere within the team. A few minutes later, headlamps were seen moving along the fixed lines above camp. Kozlov later said he was conducting final safety checks before the push. In the pre-dawn hours, according to this fictional account, Kozlov acted on his resentment. Using a climbing knife, he partially cut through fixed rope fibers at several critical anchor points. Each cut left enough strands intact to hold light tension, designed to fail only once a climber fully committed their weight. The locations were chosen at exposed traverses, where balance depended entirely on the rope system, and where a fall would be unrecoverable. Bolton clipped into the fixed line above Camp 3 and began traversing upward. Other climbers were spaced along the route, focused on their own movements. As Bolton leaned into the rope to cross an icy section, it suddenly failed with a sharp crack. He fell backward instantly. His ice axe skittered across the hardened surface without biting. Momentum carried him down slope. and he tumbled for an estimated 1,200 feet, striking ice and rock as he disappeared from view. Radio traffic erupted within seconds. Climbers above and below reported a fall, while base camp logged the incident as a rope failure. No rescue aircraft could operate at that altitude, and ground teams were forced to wait for improving conditions before attempting recovery. Bolton's helmet camera, later found with his body, recorded the moment the rope parted and the uncontrolled descent that followed. A recovery team reached him approximately 72 hours later, at an altitude just under 24,000 feet. The failed rope section was still attached to his harness. Examination showed localized, clean cuts inconsistent with gradual wear or rock damage. The coroner listed the cause of death as massive trauma from an uncontrolled fall on steep alpine terrain. An internal expedition review noted evidence of deliberate rope damage, but stopped short of issuing public criminal findings. Kozlov's guiding credentials were quietly withdrawn within this fictional narrative, and his expedition permit was not renewed. Bolton's family accepted a settlement from the expedition company under a non-disclosure agreement. Official summaries described the incident as equipment failure on the Lhotse face. Among climbers, the story circulated differently. Bolton's death was remembered not as an accident of weather or chance, but as a calculated act driven by revenge. One man's decision to silence a challenge, carried out in a place where even small betrayals are fatal. It was May 7, 2014. The Lhotse face, a 4,000-foot wall of blue glacial ice rising from Camp 2 toward Camp 3, was in its standard early May condition. Hard, steep, and completely unforgiving. Fixed ropes ran the full length of it, anchored at intervals into the ice. Temperature on the face that morning was sitting around minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit with moderate wind. For most teams, it was a routine rotation day. For one climber, it was the last morning of his life. Kalen Riker was 33, and his whole channel was built on one thing: gear. Reviews, comparisons, recommendations. Brands paid him to feature their equipment because his audience actually trusted what he said. That trust was the entire business. For the Everest expedition, he had received a full kit sponsorship covering ascenders, carabiners, harness, and crampons, all rated and certified for high-altitude use. Before departing, he returned the certified ascender and primary carabiner set to the sponsors, kept the reimbursement value, and sourced cheaper, non-certified replacements from an online supplier. Told nobody. He had climbed to 6,000 meters before and figured the swap was low risk. The gear looked identical, and that was the whole idea. I've covered a lot of cases where the decision that kills someone happens weeks before they ever get into trouble. This is one of those. So here's what an ascender actually does. It's a mechanical device that grips a fixed rope and lets you move upward on it. On a near vertical ice face, it's essentially what keeps you on the mountain. The cam mechanism inside has to work reliably in extreme cold, and that's exactly what certified gear is rated for. Cheaper non-certified versions are built to lower tolerances, weaker springs, inferior alloys, and in sub-zero temperatures, those tolerances can give out in ways you can't predict and can't recover from. On a 45-degree ice face, that kind of failure doesn't come with a warning. It just happens. During the first rotation to Camp 2, Kalen noticed his ascender felt a little stiff, but worked it manually and kept going. He even filmed a short kit review clip at Camp 2. The non-certified ascender right there in the footage, and he's naming the certified brand on camera without missing a beat. Didn't even hesitate. On the second rotation toward Camp 3 on May 7th, the overnight temperature drop had stiffened the cam mechanism even further. He was about 1,100 feet above Camp 2 on the Lhotse face when he stopped to adjust his pack. Completely routine, the kind of stop you make without thinking about it. He unweighted his ascender to reposition it higher on the rope. Standard move. Every climber on that face does it constantly. The cam didn't re-engage. He put his full body weight onto it, assuming it had locked. It hadn't. The ascender slipped down the rope before he even registered what was happening, and by then his weight was already committed. He, Amai, grabbed the fixed rope with his right hand, but it was iced over and his glove couldn't get enough grip. He went backward off the face. The fall ran roughly 300 feet before the fixed rope system caught him, but the arrest was violent. He hit the ice face during the fall and came to a stop against the rope anchor. A climbing team below saw the whole thing and reached him within 15 minutes. He was alive but unresponsive, visible head trauma, suspected spinal injury. He died before any descent could be organized. The witness team radioed base camp straight away. A helicopter was dispatched, but the Lhotse face doesn't allow for landing. It could only observe. Getting him off that face with the personnel on hand wasn't realistic. He was confirmed dead at the scene about 40 minutes after the fall. Here's the thing about this case that I find hard to shake. The fraud didn't come out on the mountain. It came out after. The ascender was recovered with the body and examined by the expedition's equipment team. Non-certified product, completely inconsistent with the brand Kalin had been claiming to use. Sponsor records confirmed the certified gear had been returned before he even left. The swap was deliberate, it was documented, and it was fatal. The camera footage from Camp 2 was recovered and reviewed. That kit review clip where he's holding the counterfeit gear and naming the certified brand is sitting right there in the incident record. Cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries consistent with a high-altitude fall. Equipment failure cited as the primary contributing factor. The gear discrepancy was formally documented and passed to the relevant authorities. No ambiguity, no loose ends. He had built an entire channel on the credibility of his gear recommendations, pocketed the budget that was supposed to keep him alive, and the mountain collected what was owed. It was April 29, 2016, and the Khumbu icefall groaned in the afternoon heat. At 29 degrees Fahrenheit, meltwater trickling through the glacier was undermining ice structures that cracked and settled all through the night. Above, Syrinx tilted at angles that looked like decisions waiting to be made. Vanessa Holt was 36, from Sydney, a former fitness influencer whose follower count had peaked around 85,000 and dropped to about 40,000. Everest was supposed to turn that around, but before leaving Australia, she'd set up a financial backstop. 3 overlapping adventure insurance policies from different providers, each covering evacuation and rescue costs. She believed the overlap would let her recover far more than the rescues actually cost. Her climbing Sherpa was Ang Cheering, 35 8 Everest summits, from Kunde. Known for one thing above all, he was always the first to move when someone needed help. 14 seasons of rescue work at altitude. That instinct was exactly what Vanessa was counting on. The first staged emergency came at Camp 1. Vanessa reported severe abdominal pain. A helicopter was called. She got flown to Kathmandu, examined, and they found nothing wrong. She filed an insurance claim within 48 hours and was back at base camp 3 days later. The second came at Camp 2. She hyperventilated on purpose and put on symptoms that looked like early-stage pulmonary edema. The expedition doctor found no fluid in her lungs but couldn't rule out early HAPE at that altitude. She got evacuated again. Second claim filed. Ang Cheering helped with the Camp 2 response, hauling supplemental oxygen across the glacier to the landing zone, adding wear on his body during an already brutal season. Between evacuations, other Sherpas noticed Vanessa bounced back too fast and showed no leftover symptoms. She came back each time with a readiness that looked more like planning than recovery. Ang Cheering told the expedition leader what he suspected, but the leader had no medical grounds to cut her. And that's the part that really gets under my skin with this one. Everyone suspected. The Sherpa saw it, the expedition leader saw it, the pattern was right there. But you can't definitively prove someone isn't sick at 21,000 feet, so nobody could stop her. She found a gap in the system and ran it 3 times. The third staged emergency was the most dangerous. At Camp 3, 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, Vanessa took medications that brought on vomiting and a racing heart. At that altitude, the symptoms were impossible to tell apart from severe acute mountain sickness. She called for help. Ang Cheering heard the radio call from above Camp 3, where he was pre-staging oxygen for the summit push. He came down to her within 30 minutes, moving fast over steep ice the way someone does after doing it dozens of times. What he found looked real. Vomiting, racing pulse, flushed skin. He started lowering her on the fixed ropes. During the descent, wind picked up on the exposed face, gusting to 35 miles per hour. The rescue became a real emergency, no matter whether the patient's condition was genuine. Ang Cheering was managing a body on 45-degree ice in worsening weather at 23,000 feet. At around 22,800 feet, the ice anchor he was waiting fractured. The screw pulled through a surface layer weakened by freeze-thaw cycling. Ang Cheering dropped 30 feet before his backup anchor caught. His body slammed into the ice wall, and the force went straight through his lower left leg. Compound fracture. Tibia and fibula both snapped, bone showing through his climbing suit. Bone through the suit. And what kills me is this is a man who was pre-staging oxygen for other people when that radio call came in. He wasn't even supposed to be on that section of the face. He went because that's what he always does. Vanessa still clipped into the lowering system, slid 50 feet before the rope caught her. She slammed into a rock, outcropping at speed. The impact fractured her pelvis, broke ribs, and ruptured something internal. A second rescue team got to them within 2 hours. Ang cheering, conscious with his leg shattered, talked the arriving Sherpas through the anchor setup, which screws were holding, which ropes were loaded, how to get Vanessa off the face without collapsing what was left. They got Vanessa down to Camp 2 by nightfall. The internal bleeding had been working for hours. Her skin was gray, her pulse weak, her breathing shallow. Conditions wouldn't allow a helicopter until morning. She died in the medical tent at Camp 2 before dawn. She was 36. Her third emergency on Everest was the only real one, and it killed her. The 2 insurance claims she'd already filed triggered a review. Both insurers investigated and denied coverage. The full scope of the fraud came out in the weeks that followed. Ang Chiring went through 3 surgeries in Kathmandu over 6 months. The fracture healed, but the joint damage was permanent. He couldn't climb above base camp anymore. 14 years of being the first to show up when someone needed help, ended by someone who never needed help at all. His family lost more than half their income. Western climbers who knew him put together a fund that covered the surgeries, but couldn't replace what the mountain had given him. A reporter asked him the following year if he was angry at Vanessa Holt. He said anger takes energy he was using for other things. When asked what those things were, he said he was learning to walk on flat ground the way he used to walk on ice. One step at a time, trusting the surface beneath him. I've ended a lot of these videos and moved on, but that answer is one I can't let go of. Learning to walk on flat ground the way he used to walk on ice. 14 years on that mountain, and that's how it ends. 6 climbers, 6 lies, and the people who paid the highest price weren't the ones who told them. It was May 7th, 2016, and the approach to Camp 2 cut across the western CWMs. The route followed wands and tracks across snow bridges, spanning crevasses deep enough to swallow climbers completely. Mark Crawford, 47, and his wife, Diane, 45, were both from Atlanta. Mark worked as a pharmaceutical sales director. Diane ran an operations consulting firm. Their experience consisted of Kilimanjaro together and an incomplete Elbrus attempt that ended early for work obligations. The Everest idea came from a YouTube documentary they watched on a flight. A polished video that showed summit day in golden light and said almost nothing about the weeks of suffering that made it possible. Their Sherpa was Mingma Jongbu, 36, from Kumjung. 7 Everest summits, respected for technical skill and situational awareness. The Crawfords' defining behavior was mutual reinforcement. Individually, either might have listened to reason. Together, every recommendation became something to negotiate. Every protocol a timeline obstacle, and any hesitation from one was quickly overridden by the other's confidence. During initial briefing, when expedition leader Furba Tashi explained standard rotation schedules, Mark asked whether timelines could be compressed for climbers in excellent condition. Furba explained acclimatization occurred at rates bodies controlled, not schedules. Diane responded that they had limited vacation time and expected efficiency. Mark nodded. The united front they presented in boardrooms now aimed at 29,000 feet. When Mingma recommended an extra rest day at Camp 2 because Diane's saturation read 72%, Mark pointed out his own reading was 76 and argued the difference proved individual variation, not inadequate acclimatization. Diane, unwilling to appear weaker than her husband, dismissed Mingma's concern and insisted they continue on the original schedule. The critical mistake began at Camp 2 during the final rotation, when Mark developed a persistent cough, dry at first, then producing clear fluid. Mingma recognized the progression immediately and recommended descent for both. Mark refused, attributing the cough to dry air and citing a climbing forum post that described identical symptoms as routine above 20,000 feet. Diane backed his assessment, adding she had experienced similar symptoms on Elbrus without issue. Mingma escalated to Furba, who examined Mark and heard subtle crackling, indicating early pulmonary edema. Furba recommended descent. Diane asked whether she could continue alone. Furba said the recommendation applied to Mark, but strongly suggested Diane also rest given her own numbers. Mark, unwilling to watch his wife continue without him, refused, stating the decision was his according to the liability waivers. The climb to Camp 3 on May 9th revealed how badly Mark's body was failing. The cough worsened, and fluid turned faintly pink, blood-tinged sputum confirming fluid leaking into lung tissue. By 23,500 feet, Mark stopped every 30 steps, his breathing a wet rattle audible to passing climbers. Diane moved more steadily, but had developed a persistent headache that worsened with altitude, and her coordination had begun slipping, fumbled carabiner clips, and misjudged distances reaching for the fixed rope. Neither acknowledged the other's deterioration. Mingma told them repeatedly they both needed immediate descent. Mark insisted he would rest at Camp 3 and reassess. That night, the mountain collected on both deaths simultaneously. Mark's breathing deteriorated into gurgling as his lungs filled faster than his body could clear. A climber in a neighboring tent heard the labored breathing around midnight and checked on them. Diane, glassy-eyed and sluggish, waved the climber away and insisted Mark was fine. The climber reported the interaction to Mingma, who went to the tent and urged immediate descent. By morning, neither responded. Mark's lips were blue, his chest producing drowning sounds, because that was exactly what was happening, his lungs filling from inside. Diane lay beside him, the cerebral edema that had started as a headache having swelled past the point where consciousness could hold. Mingma and two Sherpas found them at dawn. Mark Crawford died in his tent at Camp 3 around daybreak on May 10th. Diane Crawford died during emergency descent at approximately 22,600 feet. Mingma and the two Sherpas had to secure Mark's body before they could begin moving Diane. By the time they started lowering her down the Lhotse face, the window that might have saved her had already closed. During lowering, Mingma bore majority weight through a belay system on steep, 45-degree ice. By Camp 2, his rotator cuff had torn completely. Surgery repaired the tear, but the shoulder never recovered full strength. Mingma could no longer safely manage loads high-altitude guiding required. He retired at 37 and took a job managing a trekking shop in Namche. It was May 8, 2016. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. Advanced Base Camp on the north side sat at 21,300 feet, where climbers acclimatize before attempting higher camps during the narrow weather windows of climbing season. Valerie Hutchins was 38 years old, a housewife from Boston, Massachusetts. Her husband was a surgeon, and she had arranged childcare for their two children specifically for this expedition. Her climbing experience included guided trips to lower altitude peaks during favorable conditions. But she had never climbed above 20,000 feet. She had planned this Everest expedition for over a year as a personal challenge. She viewed weather forecasts with skepticism, believing they were often exaggerated to avoid liability. Everest's upper camps involved extreme altitude and exposure to severe weather. May marked the brief climbing season, but conditions remained unpredictable with sudden storms. Temperatures could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. The route above Camp 2 crossed exposed terrain with limited shelter. Supplemental oxygen became increasingly important at higher elevations. Equipment failure or exposure at extreme altitude could be fatal within hours. The expedition leader had received weather reports predicting dangerous wind speeds and deteriorating conditions for the upper mountain. Forecasts showed a storm system moving in earlier than the planned weather window. The leader called a meeting the evening before to postpone the move to Camp 3 at 25,000 feet. Valerie argued for over 15 minutes about the decision. The leader explained that conditions exceeded safe parameters for the team. Valerie stated she had arranged her entire schedule around this expedition and had paid significant money. The leader offered to wait for better conditions in several days. Valerie refused, saying this was her only opportunity and that she had already been away from her children for weeks. The next morning before dawn, she left Camp 2 without her team. Other climbers noticed her heading up the route alone. She carried supplemental oxygen, but her pack appeared lighter than recommended. Another climber called out to her about the weather forecast. Valerie responded that forecasts were usually wrong and that she had proper gear. She insisted she knew her capabilities. The other climber returned to his tent. She climbed through the early morning, following the fixed ropes. The first several hours were manageable as she gained elevation. Higher up, wind speeds increased noticeably. She continued upward into more exposed terrain. Valerie reached higher on the route by mid-morning. Cloud cover had moved in, and light snow began falling. Wind speeds had increased significantly. She pulled her down suit tighter and continued climbing. Visibility dropped steadily as conditions worsened. She paused at a section of fixed rope to adjust her oxygen mask. Her fingers were becoming clumsy. Despite insulated gloves, she continued for another stretch, gaining more elevation. A particularly strong gust knocked her off balance. She stumbled and fell against rock. Her down suit tore on the exposed edge. Wind began penetrating the damaged section. She stood and tried to continue, but the wind had intensified to dangerous levels. Visibility had decreased to only a few feet. She could barely see the fixed ropes ahead. She attempted to descend, but her coordination was deteriorating. Her movements became increasingly erratic as altitude and cold took their toll. The conditions made it difficult to navigate, even with the fixed lines. She moved slowly, expending energy, and losing body heat through the damaged suit. She began shivering. Snow accumulated on her clothing and equipment. She found a small area behind a rock outcrop and crouched down. The wind still reached her at that elevation. Over the next hours, her shivering decreased as her core temperature dropped. She became lethargic. Her oxygen supply was running low. She attempted to change the cylinder, but her coordination had failed. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. She slumped against the rocks. Her body was found 3 days later by a team moving between camps, located off the main route where she had sheltered. She was partially buried by snow that had accumulated during the storm. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as severe hypothermia, combined with altitude-related complications. The damaged down suit had accelerated heat loss at extreme altitude. She had been inadequately prepared for solo climbing in deteriorating conditions, lacking backup support and sufficient oxygen reserves. Her oxygen system showed she had depleted her supply. The death was determined to be accidental. It was May 18, 2017, and Camp 4 on the South Col sat under a sky clouding over, with thin cirrus streaming from the west. The temperature was minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. The debris field of the col stretched in every direction. Dented oxygen bottles, frozen guy lines, and shredded tent remnants scattered across the plateau. Sebastian Muir arrived at Camp 4 at 2 p.m., the last of his group. He was 23, an Australian from Sydney, whose father, Richard Muir, had summited Everest in 1996 and built a quiet mythology around the achievement. Photographs in the family home, an ice axe mounted above the fireplace, stories that grew more polished with each telling. Sebastian had grown up measuring himself against a standard set on a single day 21 years earlier. Of all 5 people in this video, Sebastian is the one who stayed with me longest. Not because his story is the most dramatic, it's the quietest. But he wasn't arrogant or reckless. He was just a kid trying to make his father proud on a mountain that doesn't grade on intention. His climbing experience was limited to guided treks, Kilimanjaro, the Annapurna circuit, and a failed attempt on Island Peak cut short before technical terrain. He had no experience with fixed ropes, front pointing on ice, or managing oxygen systems. His father had funded a premium placement at $65,000 and arranged for Dawa Wangchu, 45, with 12 Everest summits, to be assigned exclusively. Richard hired Dawa not to help Sebastian summit, but to keep him alive. In a satellite phone call before the summit push, Richard told Dawa that the boy coming home mattered more than the boy standing on top. Dawa understood. He had kept clients alive before by turning them around. What he could not control was a client who hid the thing that was killing him. The acclimatization rotations had been difficult. Sebastian struggled visibly above 23,000 feet, his pace slowing and his appetite vanishing for days. He developed a cough during the Camp 3 rotation that he attributed to dry air, reasonable at altitude, where persistent coughs affected nearly everyone. Dawa monitored it without alarm. At that stage, it was indistinguishable from normal altitude irritation. At Camp 4, Sebastian forced down food without appetite, his energy depleted from the Geneva spur, a headache constant behind his eyes. He was on supplemental oxygen at 2 liters per minute. Dawa checked his regulator during the evening and found it functioning properly. Sebastian reported feeling tired but fine. At approximately 9 p.m., his cough changed. The dry hack deepened into something wet, each spasm producing a gurgling sound from deep in his chest. His breathing developed a crackling quality that worsened each hour. He sat upright because lying down made the sensation of drowning more acute. He did not wake Dawa. He did not increase his oxygen flow. In an audio diary recovered later, his final entry noted his chest felt heavy, but attributed it to nerves. He stated he did not want to be the reason the team turned around. That line from the audio diary broke something in me when I first heard it. He's sitting in a tent at 26,000 feet, his lungs filling with fluid, and his last recorded thought is that he doesn't want to inconvenience anyone. 23 years old, by 11 p.m. the sound of his breathing woke Dawa. The Sherpa recognized the wet, gurgling respirations immediately, fluid filling the lungs. Sebastian was conscious but confused, responses delayed, lips blue even in the dim tent light. His symptoms had been initially indistinguishable from normal altitude exhaustion, but what had been hiding behind ordinary discomfort had accelerated beyond recovery. I've gone through enough HAPE cases to know that the window between treatable and terminal is measured in hours, not days. Sebastian spent those hours silent because he thought suffering quietly was the brave thing to do. Dawa cranked his oxygen to maximum flow and radioed base camp with a HAPE diagnosis. The response confirmed what he already knew. Altitude exceeded helicopter capability. Darkness and wind eliminated carrying him down the Geneva spur. The only treatment was oxygen, descent, and time. 2 of those 3 unavailable. Dawa propped Sebastian upright against a pack to keep fluid from pooling in his lungs. He monitored the oxygen flow, knowing the bottle would not last until morning at maximum rate. He kept talking to Sebastian in a steady voice, asking questions that received increasingly incoherent answers, then no answers at all. Sebastian's breathing became a continuous struggle, each inhalation producing a sound like water drawn through a narrow pipe. Outside the tent, other teams departed for the summit, crampons crunching on frozen ground, headlamps filing toward the triangular face. The sounds of preparation, zippers, buckles, the metallic click of carabiners filtered through the tent fabric while Dawa sat beside a 23-year-old whose lungs were filling with fluid. That contrast is the thing I keep coming back to. People heading toward their greatest achievement, 6 feet from a tent where a kid is dying. Nobody outside knew. The mountain doesn't pause for one person. Sebastian Muir died at 3:47 a.m. on May 19th, 2017. He was 23. He never left camp for the summit push. The mountain killed him in his sleeping bag while other climbers walked past his tent on their way to the top. Dawa Wangchu remained with the body until morning. The recovery took 3 days. Richard Muir was waiting in Kathmandu when his son arrived. The ice axe above the fireplace was taken down and never replaced. I thought about ending this video differently, but that image wouldn't let me. A father taking down the thing that started all of this. There's no lesson in that. Just wait. It was September 3rd, 2018, at Camp 4 on Everest's South Col. Bitter winds swept the exposed ridge, and climbers huddled in their tents for survival. Shelter and oxygen systems were critical, as even brief exposure to the thin air could turn deadly. At this altitude, failure of equipment or protection left no margin for error. Nathan Boris, 42, a petroleum geologist from Anchorage, had been climbing with expedition leader Maria Santos for 3 years. Boris had recently discovered Santos was embezzling funds from client expeditions, skimming tens of thousands of dollars, and he had confronted her at base camp with bank records and receipts. He demanded repayment and threatened to expose her upon return. Known among the team for his meticulous record-keeping and level-headed approach, Boris had always prioritized safety, following every protocol despite the extreme environment. Santos, realizing Boris's evidence could destroy her career and result in criminal charges, had grown increasingly paranoid and resentful in the days leading up to the summit push. The night before the incident, other climbers noticed Santos lingering near Boris's tent under the pretense of checking on team members. She had been overheard making statements like, "Eliminating problems permanently," and "People who threaten me don't get to leave." Using a climbing knife, she cut slashes in Boris's tent walls to create lethal wind tunnels and removed his supplemental oxygen bottles, each containing a full supply for survival at 26,000 feet. The sabotage was timed deliberately, late enough that Boris would be asleep and unable to respond, early enough that rescue in darkness and extreme weather would be impossible. Brooks awoke to the shredded tent and missing oxygen, the minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit wind immediately battering him as he realized he was exposed with no protection. Panic surged as his body temperature began to drop. and violent shivering overtook him. His fingers and toes went numb within minutes, making it nearly impossible to grip or manipulate his climbing poles. Confusion and dizziness set in quickly, and every movement became a monumental effort. He stumbled blindly across the snow, desperate for shelter, slipping repeatedly on icy patches while trying to find another tent. Each gust of wind cut through the tattered fabric of his tent, driving snow into his face and frosting his goggles, further disorienting him. As hypothermia worsened, Brooks's steps grew uncoordinated and erratic. He began moving in circles, losing awareness of direction and the distance to safety. His GPS tracker showed him covering barely 200 yards over nearly 50 minutes. His attempts to reach help thwarted by exhaustion and freezing temperatures. Each breath was shallow and painful, the thin air 1,000 feet, magnifying every struggle. Meanwhile, Santos watched from her own tent, observing his erratic movements on her device. She commented coldly, "Problem solved," as Brooks finally collapsed into the snow, unable to continue, the merciless altitude and brutal exposure ensuring there would be no recovery. Efforts to locate Boris were delayed, as Santos reported him missing at 6 a.m., claiming he had left for an unsanctioned solo summit attempt. Search teams were limited by extreme weather, steep terrain, and the assumption he had descended toward Camp 3. Boris's body was discovered 18 hours later, collapsed in a shallow depression just yards from Camp 4. The coroner determined death from severe hypothermia and exposure, with his core temperature recorded at 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Examination of his tent showed clean blade cuts, inconsistent with wind or accidental damage, and the missing oxygen bottles were found in Santos' possession. Santos's guiding permits were revoked by Nepalese authorities, but she left the country before any criminal charges could be filed. Official reports listed the incident briefly as exposure, death at Camp 4 after equipment failure, omitting the sabotage. Boris's records documenting her embezzlement were never recovered, leaving the fraud unprosecuted. Among climbers, the story circulated as one of calculated vengeance, a guide who eliminated the only witness to her crimes, weaponizing the extreme conditions of Everest to turn a confrontation over money into a fatal act of revenge. It was April 28, 2015. The Khumbu Valley was still unsettled. 3 days earlier, the Gorkha earthquake had torn through Nepal and sent shockwaves up the mountain that scattered teams, collapsed sections of the icefall, and killed climbers at base camp. But higher on the mountain, above the immediate chaos, a narrow weather window had cracked open. A handful of teams were still moving, and one climber in particular was moving fast. Not because of the window, but because of someone else. Zoran Ashby was the kind of guy who turned everything into a competition. 27 years old, fitness creator, built his whole channel around one idea, that most people are just soft. No excuses, no rest days, no slow and steady. He had learned sometime before the summit push that another creator he had publicly positioned himself against was on the mountain with a separate expedition and was ahead of him in acclimatization rotations. So Zoran pushed for the summit after completing only one rotation to Camp 2 instead of the standard 2. His expedition leader flagged it. Zoran said he felt fine. He had summited peaks up to 6,400 meters before, never anything close to Everest, and I think he genuinely believed his fitness would cover the gap. That's the thing about the mountain. It doesn't care how strong you are. Here's something most people don't think about when it comes to high altitude climbing. Acclimatization isn't optional, it's biological. Your body needs time to adjust to the drop in oxygen pressure, and there's no shortcut for that process, regardless of fitness level. Skip the rotations, and you're essentially rolling the dice on whether your body can cope with what's coming. The symptoms of a body that can't cope start subtle. A cough, some breathlessness, fatigue, easy to dismiss, easy to push through if pushing through is your whole identity. The problem is that above 23,000 feet, subtle doesn't stay subtle for long. At Camp 3, 24,500 feet, Zoran developed a persistent cough he told his Sherpa was just the dry air. His expedition doctor at base camp picked up on something during a radio check and recommended he descend for observation. Zoran declined. He cited his rival's position on the mountain. That night he slept badly, and by morning his lips had taken on a faint bluish tint his Sherpa recognized immediately. Reminds me of other cases I've covered where everyone around the victim saw it, coming before the victim did. And still, he packed up and pushed toward Camp 4. before. At what point do you stop calling it confidence and start calling it something else? He didn't make it far. Within 2 hours of leaving Camp 3, he had fallen well behind the group. The Sherpa behind him noted his pace had become slow and irregular. His breathing had changed too. The Sherpa could hear it, a wet, crackling sound with each exhale, the kind that doesn't come from dry air or exertion. At around 25,800 feet, he stopped moving and sat down on his pack. His Sherpa reached him within minutes. Zoran was conscious but confused, couldn't answer what day it was, couldn't track a simple question. His oxygen saturation read 48% on the Sherpa's pulse oximeter. To put that in context, a healthy person at sea level sits around 95 to 99%. Even accounting for altitude, 48% is critical. Fluid had filled a significant portion of both lungs. He could not stand without help. 2 Sherpas began a new, immediate descent with him, supported between them. He lost consciousness before they had covered much ground. CPR was performed on the slope for 14 minutes. He didn't respond. 14 minutes on a near vertical slope at 25,000 feet. I want you to think about what that actually looks like. Base camp was notified and a helicopter evacuation was requested, but weather conditions in the valley, still unstable in the days following the earthquake, made a high-altitude extraction impossible that morning. The team held position for 2 hours before confirming he had no pulse. His body was evacuated by helicopter 2 days later when conditions finally allowed it. I've covered deaths that were sudden and deaths that were slow. This one sits somewhere uncomfortable in between because there was a clear window where he could have turned around and chose not to. The post-mortem confirmed bilateral pulmonary edema as cause of death. Both lungs had accumulated fluid, consistent with rapid ascent without adequate acclimatization. His camera was recovered at Camp 3. The last thing on it was a clip filmed the morning of his final push, him visibly struggling to finish sentences, breathless between every few words. The expedition's radio logs confirmed the descent recommendation had been issued and declined roughly 18 hours before he died. The case was ruled accidental, with self-directed deviation from the acclimatization protocol listed as the primary contributing factor. Zoran had spent years telling his audience that the body could handle anything if the mind was strong enough. Everest answered that one for him. It was April 19, 2017, and the air at Everest Base Camp carried the metallic edge of snow that had melted and refrozen overnight. The temperature sat around 24 degrees Fahrenheit, with gusts pushing through the Khumbu Glacier, strong enough to rattle tent poles and send loose equipment skidding across ice. Prayer flags strung between expedition clusters snapped in bursts, their frayed edges worn thin by seasons of wind and ultraviolet light. The camp was deep into its rhythm. Teams had been on the mountain for weeks, and the icefall doctors had established and maintained the route through the Khumbu since early April. Lauren Shale arrived 3 weeks late. She was 41 years old, a corporate consultant from Denver who had rebranded herself as an adventure athlete after guided trips up Kilimanjaro and a partial ascent of Elbrus. 2 expedition companies had rejected her Everest application for insufficient experience. A third, a budget operator in Kathmandu, with a reputation for flexibility, declined at first, but reversed the decision after Lauren wired an additional payment to the owner's personal account. The operator reassigned an unused permit from a canceled client and added Lauren to the roster mid-season. The field team was never told. When Lauren showed up at base camp, the expedition leader didn't recognize her. The client manifest listed 7 climbers. Lauren made 8. She produced paperwork showing the Kathmandu office had added her, and a phone call to the operator produced vague confirmation. The money had already been accepted. Lakpa Rangdu, the expedition's lead Sherpa, 36 years old with 9 Everest summits, saw the problem right away. Oxygen allocations, tent assignments, food rations, and Sherpa pairings had all been calculated for 7. Adding an 8th without adjustments meant someone would come up short when it mattered. That's what gets me every time with these stories. The guy with 9 summits flags the problem on day 1, and the answer is basically, figure it out. The first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu icefall exposed Lauren completely. She clipped her ascender backward twice. She froze on a ladder crossing until a line of climbers stacked up behind her. Her crampon technique alternated between flat footing, where she should have been front pointing, and dragging her feet in ways that snagged the rope. Lakpa corrected her patiently at first, then firmly, then with visible concern. Other clients on the rotation started requesting different group assignments. Nobody wanted to be roped to someone who couldn't keep pace, and the resentment was building quietly across the team. When Lakpa brought it to the expedition leader, Lauren was standing right there and jumped in, insisting her performance was normal for a first rotation. She name-dropped routes in Patagonia and a winter Denali attempt. A client who had actually climbed the Patagonian route later told the guide team that Lauren's descriptions didn't match the terrain. And look, I've seen climbers stretch their resumes before. Everyone adds a little polish. But making up entire routes you've never set foot on while standing next to people who have, that's a different level. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet confirmed everything. Lauren stumbled on flat glacier terrain, burned through water at twice the rate of other clients, and needed rest stops that pushed the group 2 hours behind. The third rotation reached only 22,800 feet, well short of Camp 3 at 23,500. Lauren couldn't hold front point technique on steep ice. Lakpa had to physically guide her boots into placements. They turned back. Lauren had never acclimatized above 23,000 feet. When the summit window opened, the expedition leader barred Lauren from the push. Her response was controlled, but threatening. She would contact the Kathmandu operator, have the guide replaced, and pursue legal action for services not rendered. She appeared to accept the decision. She did not. Lauren tagged along with another team's rope line during the afternoon, pushed to the South Col. In the crowding and wind, Sherpas assumed she belonged to a neighboring expedition. That night, Lakpa found her on the fixed ropes at 27,000 feet, climbing alone in the dark with no Sherpa assigned. Base camp radioed to turn her around, but pulling someone off a fixed rope who won't cooperate at that altitude risks both lives. Lauren refused to go down. They found her body the following afternoon at around 27,800 feet, seated against a rock band above the balcony. Her oxygen mask hung around her neck. Her hands were bare. Her eyes were open. She had never acclimatized above 23,000 feet, and cerebral edema had done what it always does to unprepared bodies. She was 41 years old. The bare hands are the detail I keep coming back to. Severe haste destroys judgment so completely that climbers stop protecting themselves from the cold. The brain can't process danger anymore. She was freezing to death and didn't have the awareness left to care. The Kathmandu operator faced investigation. 2 legitimate clients on the expedition failed to summit because Lauren's presence had thrown off the rotation schedule and squeezed their acclimatization windows. It was April 23, 2016, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet was entering the final phase before the spring summit window. Prayer flags snapped above tent clusters, sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier, and temperatures hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit in early morning. Among the teams preparing were Rebecca Holloway, 47, from Dallas, and Jennifer Caldwell, 45, from Austin. Friends who had met through a fitness studio and decided Everest would be their ultimate achievement after watching a viral summit video that made the climb look like a guided hike with a view. Rebecca ran a marketing consultancy. Jennifer maintained a lifestyle blog with 78,000 followers. Neither had climbed above Kilimanjaro. They paid $68,000 each to a mid-tier Nepali operator. Their Sherpa was Temba Rigzan, 41, from Kumjung, 11 Everest summits, known for patience with inexperienced climbers, but uncompromising on safety. His income supported his wife, 3 children, and his sister's family. The $8,500 fee for guiding both women represented nearly half his annual earnings. The problems began during the first icefall crossing when Rebecca and Jennifer treated the route as a content opportunity. They stopped repeatedly for coordinated photos at ladder crossings, asked Temba to film video clips, and insisted on retakes when lighting did not meet their standards. What should have been a 4-hour crossing stretched to nearly 6 as other teams passed and the sun warmed the glacier into instability. Temba explained that time in the icefall directly correlated to exposure beneath shifting seracs. Rebecca responded that their sponsors expected quality content. The behavior continued through rotations. At Camp 2, they spent 90 minutes staging photos with the Lhotse face in the background. At Camp 3, Jennifer filmed a monologue about mental toughness despite visible exhaustion. When Temba checked their oxygen saturation at 23,500 feet and found Rebecca at 71% and Jennifer at 69%, he recommended immediate descent. Both dismissed the suggestion. citing YouTube videos of climbers who had continued with similar numbers. The summit push departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 18th. They climbed slowly but steadily through the first hours. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, the rest stops lengthened and breathing became labored. Around dawn, with the summit 1,200 feet above, the weather shifted. Cloud built from the southwest and wind increased to 30-mile-per-hour gusts. Temba told Rebecca and Jennifer they needed to descend immediately. Rebecca pointed at the visible summit and said they were too close to turn back. Jennifer agreed, stating they had promised their followers a summit. By 10:30 a.m., at 28,400 feet, visibility collapsed into a whiteout driven by 40-mile-per-hour gusts. Temba stopped and told both women they were turning around immediately. They resisted, insisting on pausing for conditions to clear. With all three clipped to the fixed line, Temba began clearing a buried section of rope at a transition point, a task requiring both hands in near-zero visibility. The work took less than a minute. When Temba looked up, both women had unclipped from the line. He could not see their headlamps. In whiteout conditions at 28,400 feet, a few meters off the packed track was enough to erase all visual reference. No contrast, no horizon, no depth. He searched for 35 minutes, following tracks that showed movement, downslope and off-route, before losing them in drifting snow. Then he returned to the fixed line and descended to Camp 4, arriving severely hypothermic. Rebecca Holloway and Jennifer Caldwell were found the following morning, approximately 200 feet off-route at 28,300 feet. Both had frozen to death. Their cameras contained footage filmed at 28,400 feet, showing them discussing how close they were to the summit. Temba participated in the recovery despite severe frostbite on 3 fingers. Surgeons amputated the distal portions of his index, middle, and ring fingers. The loss reduced his grip strength enough that technical ice climbing became dangerous. He retired from high-altitude work at 43. It was May 23, 2015. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. The Hillary Step at 28,839 feet marked one of the final technical obstacles before the summit, where climbers queued on fixed ropes during busy weather windows. Heather Brooke was 33 years old, an accountant from San Francisco, California. She had planned this expedition as the culmination of years of training and saving. Her climbing fitness was good, and she had completed several high-altitude climbs on other mountains. She believed she could move efficiently through the summit push and handle the challenges of the death zone. Everest's summit push required climbers to navigate through the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body could not survive for extended periods. The Hillary Step was a near-vertical rock face requiring climbers to ascend and descend using fixed ropes. Traffic jams at the step were common during peak season, causing dangerous delays. Climbers waiting in the death zone depleted oxygen supplies and energy reserves. Frostbite, exhaustion, and oxygen deprivation could occur rapidly during delays. The expedition leader briefed the team at Camp 4 before the summit push. He explained that if traffic was heavy at the Hillary Step, they might need to turn around to avoid dangerous delays. Heather listened but made a comment about not turning back after coming this far. Another climber mentioned that waiting in line at altitude could be fatal. Heather cut him off, saying she had been planning this for years and that she could handle the wait. She added that this was her only chance and she wasn't wasting it. The team left Camp 4 after midnight. Heather climbed steadily through the darkness, using supplemental oxygen and following the fixed ropes. Progress was slow in the extreme altitude. By mid-morning, they reached the Hillary Step. A long line of climbers from multiple expeditions was queued on the ropes. The guide estimated a significant wait. The guide gathered the team and recommended they turn around due to the delay. Heather refused. She said she had come too far to turn back now. The guide explained that waiting would deplete their oxygen and energy, making the descent dangerous. Heather argued that she had enough oxygen and could manage. Other team members agreed to descend, but Heather insisted on staying. The guide reluctantly agreed to wait with her, but emphasized they would need to move quickly once through. Heather waited in line at the Hillary Step for an extended period. The temperature was well below zero. She stood clipped to the fixed rope, barely moving. Her oxygen supply was depleting steadily. Her extremities were becoming numb despite insulated gear. Finally, she reached the base of the step and began ascending the near vertical section. She summited after the extended delay. She spent several minutes on top, taking photos despite the guides urging to descend immediately. By the time they began descending, her oxygen supply was running low. She changed to her reserve cylinder. The descent back to the Hillary step took longer than expected. Heather's movements had slowed noticeably. When they reached the step, another queue had formed for the descent. Climbers were backed up, waiting to descend the fixed ropes. The guide's concern was evident. Heather's oxygen ran out while waiting. She began using the guide's emergency supply. Her coordination deteriorated rapidly without adequate oxygen. When her turn came to descend the step, her movements were clumsy and slow. Partway down the vertical section, she lost her footing. Her weight came onto the fixed rope and safety system. She hung suspended, unable to regain her footing on the near vertical surface. The guide above tried to assist but couldn't reach her position safely. Other climbers helped lower her the rest of the way down the step. She was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The guide and other climbers attempted to move her downward, but she could no longer coordinate her movements. She collapsed on the route below the Hillary step. Despite efforts to revive her and administer oxygen from other climbers' supplies, she did not regain consciousness. She died on the route in the death zone. Her body remained on the mountain. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from severe hypoxia and exhaustion in the death zone. The extended delay at the Hillary step had depleted her oxygen supply and energy reserves. The lack of supplemental oxygen at extreme altitude had caused rapid deterioration of brain and organ function. Contributing factors included the decision to wait in the queue, despite warnings and extended time in the death zone without adequate oxygen. The death was ruled accidental. It was May 8th, 2018, and the upper Lhotse face gleamed under a sky so blue it looked synthetic. The temperature at 24,000 feet hovered around -8 degrees Fahrenheit, with gusts ripping snow off the surface and sending it streaming across the blue ice. The face angled between 40 and 50 degrees, a continuous wall where fixed ropes provided the only security. Old frayed lines from previous seasons hung slack beside this year's fresh cord. Martin Kreis ascended with mechanical precision, his Jumar sliding upward in metered intervals, matching a cadence from his army career. He was 56, a retired colonel from Fort Bragg, who had spent 3 decades commanding units where discomfort was standard and complaining was weakness. He had climbed Rainier once and attempted Denali the previous year, turning back at 17,000 feet. He described the retreat in his application as a strategic withdrawal necessitated by external factors, framing failure as command judgment. I've read a lot of expedition applications putting these stories together, and I can tell you, the ones that dress up a retreat in military language are always the ones that worry me most. His Sherpa, Chewang Lakpa, 36, had summited Everest 4 times. Chewang had noticed problems since the first rotation. Martin climbed rigidly, refusing to adapt his pace, treating the mountain as an obstacle course where consistency guaranteed progress. When Chewang suggested rest stops, Martin dismissed them. When Chewang pointed out altitude stress, persistent headaches, slight stumbles on the fixed lines, Martin responded with the authority of someone unaccustomed to subordinates, questioning his assessment. The dynamic was clear from the start. Martin treated Chewang like a private giving a briefing he hadn't asked for. And that's the thing about altitude sickness. It doesn't care about rank. On this push to Camp 3, Martin's coordination had been deteriorating for over an hour. His fingers showed the waxy white patches of frost nip, which he dismissed when Chewang pointed them out. His crampon placements had become irregular, front points striking ice at odd angles. Rest stops occurred involuntarily as he paused mid-step, confused, as though he had forgotten what he was doing. Chewang recognized high-altitude cerebral edema building. Ataxia, confusion, the slow erosion of motor control as the brain swelled against the skull. He told Martin they needed to descend immediately. Martin refused, quietly, certainly, with 30 years of authority behind it. Camp 3 was close. He needed to push through the wall. The wall, Chewang knew, was his brain dying. I keep circling back to that phrase. Push through the wall. In a gym, that's how you build strength. On the Lhotse face at 23,000 feet, it's how your body writes a death sentence your mind can no longer read. At approximately 1:15 p.m., around 23,200 feet, Martin stopped and looked around with an expression of recognition that was entirely false. he announced they had reached Camp 3 and began unclipping his Jumar. Chiwang lunged for his arm but was a body length below on the steep face. Martin freed himself from the line and stepped onto unprotected blue ice at 45 degrees. He managed a couple of unstable steps before his crampons lost purchase. There was no self-arrest. His ice axe was clipped to his harness, and his coordination was too compromised to execute the maneuver. He slid immediately, accelerating down the polished surface. Chiwang watched him disappear below the curve of the face in 4 seconds. Martin Kreis was found the following morning, approximately 1,800 feet below the point where he is unclipped. He was 56. Camp 3 had been another 300 vertical feet above the spot where he decided he had already arrived. That detail is the one I can't shake. He died 300 feet below the place he was trying to reach. Believing he was already there, I don't know a lonelier way to go than that. It was April 8th, 2014 in the western CWM on Mount Everest. Climbers navigated a flat glacier valley riddled with hidden crevasses, where snow bridges could collapse without warning. Temperatures were freezing, the air thin, and every movement physically taxing. Roping together was standard protocol for safety, as falling into a crevasse without support almost always meant certain death. Loiselle Chan, 29, a medical resident from San Francisco, was traversing the glacier with guidance from her teammate Rebecca Trevo. Chan was an experienced rock climber, but relatively new to high-altitude mountaineering, relying heavily on Trevo's expertise. Unbeknownst to Chan, she had been dating Trevo's ex-husband, Dyson, for 6 months, a relationship that had contributed to Trevo's bitter divorce and loss of custody. Chan had no idea of Trevo's connection until base camp, where Trevo's anger toward her became evident. Rebecca Trevo, 35, a seasoned climbing guide, harbored deep resentment. She had lost her home and custody of her children and blamed Chan for disrupting her family. According to other climbers, Trevo became increasingly hostile toward Chan, making pointed remarks about homewreckers getting what they deserve. Trevo had been practicing knots and rope-cutting techniques under the pretense of reviewing rescue procedures, and the night before the incident, she was overheard threatening over satellite phone to make Dyson pay for what he's done. Trevo planned her revenge meticulously. She identified a section of the western CWM where deep crevasses made rescue nearly impossible. Guiding Chan to a particularly unstable snow bridge, Trevo positioned herself to act when Chan fell, carrying a razor-sharp climbing knife specifically for the purpose. The setup relied entirely on Chan trusting Trevo's guidance in a place where one mistake could be fatal. During the morning climb, Chan carefully stepped onto a seemingly solid snow bridge, spanning a narrow crevasse. The bridge creaked under her weight, small cracks forming at the edges as she tested her footing. Within seconds, the snow gave way beneath her boots, and she fell roughly 15 feet onto a ledge inside the crevasse. Her rope system, normally a reliable lifeline, was her only protection as she struggled to regain balance while gasping for breath in the thin, freezing air. The walls of the crevasse towered above and below her, jagged ice threatening to cut through clothing or skin with the slightest misstep. As Chan ascended the rope, Torres struck with deliberate precision, severing all fibers with a knife and sending them fluttering into the cold air. The sudden loss of her lifeline threw Chan off balance, and the brittle snow bridge beneath her gave way entirely. She plunged 180 feet into the crevasse, tumbling against icy ledges and jagged walls as her headlamp spun wildly and snow sprayed around her. The combination of deliberate sabotage and the collapsing bridge left no chance of survival, turning a recoverable fall into a calculated, fatal descent. Trevo's helmet camera captured her actions and chillingly recorded her saying, "Some problems solve themselves," before she radioed base camp, claiming a rope snapped under load. Rescue teams reached the site hours later, but the unstable ice and extreme depth made immediate recovery impossible. Chan's body was eventually retrieved 2 weeks later using specialized rigging systems. The coroner confirmed the cause of death as impact trauma and hypothermia, noting multiple fractures from striking ice walls, and forensic examination revealed clean knife cuts on the rope rather than natural wear or overload failure. Trevo left Nepal shortly after the incident, claiming emotional trauma and cooperating minimally with authorities. Investigation was hampered by her licensed guide status and lack of eyewitnesses. A brief notice in Rock and Ice magazine listed the event as a crevasse fall, leaving the story's darker truth largely unknown. Chan's ex-husband, Dyson Trevo, received her life insurance payout, and never learned that her death had been a calculated act of revenge. One climber exploiting trust in the high mountains to punish a personal betrayal. It was May 23rd, 2017. The upper mountain was clear, one of those rare summit windows that pulls every waiting team out of their tents at once. The south col was crowded. Fixed ropes above the balcony were moving slowly under the weight of traffic, and temperatures at the summit that morning were sitting around minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be in a line of people all quietly racing the same clock, that's the south col on a good weather day. Everyone up there knows the window. Everyone up there is counting. Kelso Prin had a different kind of count going. 34 years old, content creator, built his whole thing around firsts. First to broadcast live from extreme locations. First to put his audience inside moments nobody had streamed before. Everest was his largest production yet, and he had secured paid access from his audience to watch a live summit broadcast, his primary revenue event for the year. He had reached high altitude before on Aconcagua without serious incident, and I think that probably gave him more confidence than the situation actually warranted. He arrived with a custom-rigged satellite broadcast pack that shared a battery system with his heated glove liners, a setup his own technician had flagged as a power management risk before departure. Kelso noted it and moved on. Someone had already seen it coming, so what was he thinking? Here's the thing about summit day on Everest. You're basically running a race where the finish line is also the halfway point. You push through the night, hit the top, and then you still have to get all the way back down before the mountain decides it's done cooperating. Every team on that col knew the drill. Kelso knew it too. He just had a live audience to keep happy on top of all that, and that's where things started getting complicated. The live stream kicked off at Camp 4 and ran straight through the ascent. The battery pack was drawing more power than anticipated. Lithium batteries lose significant efficiency below freezing, something that hadn't been properly accounted for at that altitude. The drain was happening the entire time, quietly, steadily, with every hour of broadcast. By the time Kelso reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, his heated glove liners had dropped to minimal function. He noticed his fingertips were numb. He kept moving. He didn't switch off the broadcast. People had paid for it, and he wasn't about to cut the feed with the summit still above him. I get the logic, but the mountain was already collecting on that decision, and he had no idea. He reached the summit and broadcast from the top for close to 20 minutes. By any measure, that's the moment the whole expedition was built around. What nobody watching could see was that his hands were already in serious trouble. The glove system had been effectively dead for hours. He turned around and started down, and that's when the full weight of it started to show. The descent required heavy Sherpa assistance because Kelso could not grip the fixed ropes properly. Not struggling, could not grip. He reached Camp 4 by early afternoon, and the expedition medic at base camp pushed hard for an immediate helicopter evacuation. Both hands were waxy, pale, hardening across all fingers. Kelso refused. He had announced a post-summit recovery series during the live stream, and he intended to film it from base camp. He wasn't going anywhere. And this, right here, is where the story stops being about equipment failure and turns into something else entirely. He spent 2 nights at Camp 4 before working his way down to base camp over the following days. 4 days after summiting, by the time he got there, both hands had visible tissue discoloration, skin beginning to blister. He was evacuated to a lower altitude medical facility, but not because he agreed to go. The expedition leader overrode his refusal and arranged transport. By the time he reached medical care, the infection had spread well beyond his hands. Surgical intervention was attempted. It wasn't enough. Kelso Prin died 9 days after standing on the summit of Everest. 9 days. He survived the climb, survived the descent, made it all the way back to base camp, and then died from something that was entirely preventable if he had just left when he was told to. The findings confirmed septic shock as cause of death, secondary to bilateral deep frostbite with critically delayed treatment. The report was blunt about it. Evacuation within 24 hours of descent would have significantly changed the outcome. I think about that a lot. 24 hours was all the margin there was between a bad outcome and a survivable one. Battery drain logs from the broadcast rig confirmed the power crossover failure. The glove system had been running well below effective output long before he reached the summit. The live stream footage was reviewed and the timeline reconstructed from it. The expedition's formal report noted that evacuation had been recommended and refused on 2 separate occasions before the leader stepped in. The case was closed as accidental death, delayed treatment listed as the determining factor. It was May 18, 2013, and the Lhotsa face gleamed under mid-morning sun like polished blue glass. Fixed ropes running up the face were packed with climbers from multiple teams, each moving at their own pace while Sherpas threaded between them, hauling loads. Nicola Pryor was 39, from London, stuck behind a climber who stopped every 15 steps. Her budget expedition ran large groups with barely any Sherpa support, and the pace was set by the slowest person on the team. Nicola was fitter than all of them, and the frustration had been building since the first rotation. She had noticed the faster expedition days earlier: efficient clients, more oxygen, better gear. On summit push day, she left Camp 3 early and fell in behind the faster group. She clipped onto their rope and slotted herself into their line like she belonged. Kanchanuru, the faster expedition's lead Sherpa, 40 with 12 Everest summits, spotted her at a rest stop around 24,800 feet. He checked with his expedition leader by radio. She wasn't on the manifest. His expedition had contributed to the shared route-fixing effort above Camp 3. The oxygen at Camp 4 was set aside for his clients. Her being there threw off the safety math he was running. Nicola accused him of harassment, told him she'd report him if he kept going. I need to be honest, when I got to this part I had to read it again. She's outside any logistics chain, using oxygen she didn't pay for, with no rescue plan if anything goes wrong, and when the lead Sherpa asks her to leave, she threatens to report him. The audacity is hard to overstate. Kancha made a call. He left her, moved his clients forward, radioed her expedition company, and focused on the people he was actually responsible for. Nicola kept going alone, drifting behind teams she didn't belong to, resting when they rested, moving when they moved. Two Sherpas from different expeditions later said they saw her take an oxygen bottle from a cache at Camp 4 that was clearly labeled for another team. I want you to think about that. That bottle was carried to 26,000 feet on someone's back, cached for a client who might need it to survive the descent. And she just grabs it. She ducked into an empty tent on the South Col and rested before the summit push. Using shelter she hadn't arranged and fuel she hadn't paid for, she left for the summit that night, following headlamps in the dark, carrying one oxygen bottle with no spare and no Sherpa keeping track of her. She reached the balcony at 27,600 feet behind the main groups, already hours deep into her single bottle supply. Above the balcony, the math turned fatal. At the flow rate she was using, her single bottle was nearing depletion. The summit was still 1,400 vertical feet above. No spare, no Sherpa carrying extra supply, and nobody on the mountain tracking where she was. Nicola Pryor was found at around 28,200 feet, slumped against the fixed rope. Climbers coming down from the summit first assumed she was resting. A Sherpa who checked on her 2 hours later found no pulse. She was 39 years old. Nobody on the entire mountain was tracking her. I keep landing on that because it's the thing that makes budget expeditions so dangerous. She walked away from the only people responsible for her, and nothing existed to catch her before the mountain did. Kanchanuru was questioned about leaving her on the rope. Sherpa teams across the mountain backed his decision without exception. He had protected the clients in his care. Budget operators had been a growing problem on Everest for years. They undercut established companies by stripping services to the minimum. Smaller Sherpa teams, fewer oxygen bottles, less communication gear, and almost no oversight once clients left base camp. For climbers who couldn't afford premium expeditions, they were the only option. But the trade-off was simple. You paid less, got less, and when something went wrong above 26,000 feet, nobody was coming. Nicola's expedition couldn't even confirm she was missing until other teams reported it. It was May 18, 2017, and Camp 4 at 26,000 feet clung to a wind-swept col where tents fought constant gusts and thin air, turned simple tasks into exhausting efforts. Sandra Whitfield, 50 from Seattle, had spent 6 months preparing by consuming every piece of online content she could find. She had watched hundreds of summit videos, read dozens of blog posts, and participated in forums where amateurs shared advice with the confidence of people who had never been above 20,000 feet. Her actual experience consisted of Rainier, Kilimanjaro, and one unsuccessful Aconcagua attempt ending at high camp. Her Sherpa was Chetan Dorje, 42, from Tame, 10 Everest summits, known for patience with inexperienced clients and explaining technical concepts clearly. Sandra's defining behavior was constant correction based on YouTube videos. She questioned Chetan's rope management, pacing, oxygen flow, and weather assessment, At Camp 2, she told Chetan his clipping method was inefficient compared to a sport climbing video. Chetan explained the method was designed for rock roots and gym walls, light gloves, full cognitive function, visible handholds. High-altitude work required simpler, redundant systems because cold and hypoxia made fine motor tasks unreliable. Sandra dismissed this as resistance to innovation. The critical issue emerged around oxygen management. At Camp 4, Chetan set Sandra's regulator to 4 liters per minute. Sandra immediately reduced flow to 2 liters, explaining a video said experienced climbers conserved oxygen by running minimal rates. Chetan reset the regulator and explained inadequate flow in the death zone would cause rapid cognitive decline, that the climbers in those videos were highly acclimatized veterans, and their physiology bore no resemblance to hers. They departed at 11 p.m. Sandra climbed steadily for 2 hours, but above 27,000 feet, her pace deteriorated in ways oxygen should have prevented. Chetan checked her regulator and found she had reduced flow to 1 liter, barely enough to sustain consciousness. He reset it to 4 liters and told her directly that reducing oxygen was killing her. Sandra insisted she was following expert advice. Above 28,000 feet, hypoxia overwhelmed her. Sandra's cognitive function declined until she could no longer distinguish between Chetan's protocols and the video techniques she had memorized at sea level. At a transition point where the fixed rope changed anchors, she attempted a clipping method from a sport climbing tutorial, unclipping both tethers simultaneously before reclipping, a movement suicidal on a 40-degree ice slope at 28,200 feet in darkness. Chetan was 3 feet behind her on the rope. He saw her hands move to both carabiners and shouted for her to stop. Sandra either did not hear or did not process the instruction. For 3 seconds, she stood free on exposed ice with nothing securing her. Her crampon slipped. She fell. The fall carried her approximately 400 feet down steep terrain before impact with rock stopped movement. Chetan descended immediately but knew from the angle and distance that survival was impossible. He found Sandra's body wedged against an outcrop. She had died on impact. Expedition leaders determined her body created a route hazard, and insurance pressured the company into recovery. Chetan volunteered, descending off route across steep, ice-glazed rock. During approach, his crampon scraped across verglas without catching. He fell 20 feet before arresting, but impact fractured his left ankle and opened a deep laceration across his calf. The injury made climbing impossible. Other Sherpas completed recovery while Chetan was evacuated to Kathmandu. The ankle required surgery, but infection set in during the days between injury and treatment. Despite antibiotics, infection spread to bone tissue and forced partial amputation of his left foot, ending any possibility of technical climbing or high-altitude work. Chetan retired from guiding at 42, not because he wanted to, but because a client who had watched YouTube videos believed she knew more than someone who had summited Everest 10 times. He returned to Tame and took work maintaining trekking trails, a job that kept him in the mountains, but reminded him daily of what following bad advice had cost. It was May 11, 2017. Mount Everest rose to 29,032 feet on the border between Nepal and Tibet, the highest peak on Earth. At Camp 2 in the western CWM, climbers rested in their tents at 21,000 feet, preparing for rotations to higher camps. Shelby Fairchild was 51 years old, a grandmother and part-time yoga instructor from Greenwich, Connecticut. She had recently become a grandmother and wanted to prove she was still capable of major physical achievements. She had paid significant money for a guided Everest expedition using inheritance funds. Her climbing experience included guided trips to Kilimanjaro and a failed attempt on Aconcagua, where she had turned back due to altitude sickness. She was fit for her age but had never spent extended time above 20,000 feet. She viewed the expedition as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and was determined to be the grandmother who summited Everest. Everest's extreme altitude created severe physiological challenges. Above 21,000 feet, the body deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen levels were a fraction of sea level. Altitude sickness could progress from mild symptoms to life-threatening conditions within hours. High-altitude pulmonary edema involved fluid accumulation in the lungs, causing breathing difficulty and chest tightness. The only effective treatment was rapid descent to lower elevation. Supplemental oxygen provided temporary relief, but was not a substitute for descent. Climbers needed to carry their own equipment and maintain self-sufficiency even with guide support. The expedition had spent weeks acclimatizing through rotations between camps. Shelby had complained of headaches for multiple days, but insisted they were tension headaches from stress. The lead guide conducted daily health checks. At Camp 2, Shelby's oxygen saturation was measured below the normal range for that altitude. She had developed a persistent dry cough. The guide recommended descending to base camp for rest and monitoring. Shelby refused, stating she was on a schedule and needed to continue upward to Camp 3. She had been asking guides to carry portions of her gear since lower camps. The guides explained that each climber needed to manage their own equipment for safety and self-sufficiency. Shelby argued that she had paid for a premium service and expected accommodation. She stated that carrying equipment was what guides were for. The guides explained that at extreme altitude, each person needed to be self-sufficient. Shelby became irritated and mentioned the significant amount of money she had invested in the expedition. By evening, Shelby's cough had worsened, and she was breathing more rapidly than normal. She had difficulty sleeping, despite supplemental oxygen. The next morning, the guide strongly recommended she descend immediately to base camp. Shelby refused, saying she hadn't paid thousands of dollars to turn back. She insisted the symptoms were minor and would improve with rest. The guide explained that her symptoms indicated possible pulmonary edema, and that continuing upward could be fatal. Shelby became angry and accused them of trying to end the expedition early. She threatened to leave negative reviews and contact the company owner. After extensive discussion, the guides made the decision to begin descending with her, explaining they would not allow her to continue upward in this condition. The descent began mid-morning. Shelby moved slowly, stopping frequently. Her breathing was labored, and she was coughing more frequently. As they descended through the western WM toward base camp, she was coughing up small amounts of pink, frothy fluid. The guides increased the pace of descent. Shelby's breathing became increasingly difficult. Her lips had a bluish tint. She stopped and sat down in the snow. The guides administered supplemental oxygen from the emergency supply. They helped her to her feet and supported her weight as they continued descending. Her cough produced more pink froth. As they continued lower, her breathing had become a wet, gurgling sound. She could no longer walk, even with support. The guides radioed ahead for assistance. Additional team members came up from base camp with a rescue sled. Her consciousness was fading. Her breathing became irregular and gasping. The guides placed her on the sled and began moving her downward as quickly as possible. She stopped breathing. They performed resuscitation efforts while continuing to descend toward base camp. She remained unresponsive. They confirmed death after extended efforts. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as high-altitude pulmonary edema. The lungs had filled with fluid, preventing oxygen from entering the bloodstream. Contributing factors included inadequate acclimatization response, refusal to descend despite early symptoms, and delayed descent when symptoms became severe. The examiner noted that pulmonary edema was reversible with prompt descent, and that her death could likely have been prevented if she had descended when first advised. The delay had allowed the condition to progress beyond recovery. It was May 8, 2017, and Everest Base Camp was bright and still, the sun softening the glacier into a wet sheen. The temperature hit 31 degrees Fahrenheit, mild enough to make the mountain feel almost welcoming. Andrea Farr was 47, from Miami, a hedge fund manager who solved problems with capital. Mountains, she was finding out, didn't respond to money. Her body needed weeks to adapt to altitude, and no wire transfer could speed that up. She had done one rotation to Camp 1, which wiped her out more than expected. The schedule called for 2 more over 10 days. Andrea saw dead time. The arrangement went through a helicopter company in Kathmandu. Fake a knee injury, get evacuated, have the helicopter land at Camp 2 instead of flying to Kathmandu. She iced and compressed her knee overnight to create swelling. The expedition doctor found inflammation that looked like a soft tissue injury and called for evacuation. I've covered a lot of shortcuts people take on this mountain, but this one is something else. You can buy your way past a lot of things in life, but you cannot buy your way past biology. Red blood cells don't care how much money you have. The helicopter lifted off from base camp and instead of heading to Kathmandu, set down at Camp 2 on the western CWM. Cash to intermediaries ensured the flight log listed a weather diversion near Farich. Andrea stepped onto the glacier at 21,000 feet with a body that had spent one night above 19,000. Her blood hadn't adapted. Her lungs hadn't adjusted. Her brain hadn't recalibrated. Every system still thought it was at sea level. Sonam Rinjing, 31, her assigned climbing Sherpa with 6 summits, came up with a regular rotation the next day and found Andrea already in her tent. The knee looked fine. Sonam checked with base camp, confirmed the story, and reported what he saw. This woman had not acclimatized. Taking her higher was a medical risk. Andrea waved it off and reminded everyone what she'd paid. They let her try for Camp 3 with close monitoring. At 22,500 feet altitude her body had zero adaptation for. She got hit with a crushing headache. Her coordination fell apart. Her crampon placements were sloppy. Sonam watched her responses come slower, watched her eyes glaze over, watched acute mountain sickness speed toward something worse. Sonam told her to go down. Andrea refused. She made it to 23,000 feet before she couldn't clip her own ascender without someone guiding her hands. Her words were garbled. She kept fumbling gears she'd used for weeks. Full haste, severe cerebral edema shutting her brain down. Sonam and a second Sherpa started lowering her down the Lhotse face. Andrea turned combative, her dying brain reading rescue as an attack. She swung her arms, fighting them. And here's the thing that wrecks me about HACE. The person you're saving fights you. They don't understand you're helping. Their brain turns rescue into threat, and Sonam is absorbing punches on steep ice, trying to keep this woman alive. Her ice axe caught Sonam in the shoulder. In the same moment, Andrea unclipped her own harness. She slid right away on the steep ice and fell roughly 800 feet before hitting a rock shelf. The injuries were catastrophic. 800 feet. That's roughly the height of a 60-story building, and the only reason it stopped there was because the rock shelf caught her. Without it, the Lhotse face doesn't end for another 2,000 feet. Sonam Rinjing needed surgery in Kathmandu, torn ligaments that never fully healed. He couldn't go back to high-altitude guiding. He ended up doing trekking work in the lower Khumbu at about half the pay, supporting a wife, 2 kids, aging parents, and a younger brother still in school. Half the income, because a woman from Miami couldn't sit still for 10 days. I don't know how you process that math. It was May 19th, 2017, and the summit push from Camp 4 began at midnight, under a sky dense with stars. The temperature at 26,000 feet was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, wind gusts reaching 30 miles per hour. The South Col was a wasteland, crushed oxygen bottles, shredded tents, frozen waste, and the occasional body too difficult to remove. Headlamps ascending the triangular face above camp stretched like a strand of lights into the darkness. Warren Ossie climbed near the back of his group, noticeably slower. He was 44, a British Ghanaian hedge fund manager from London, whose firm managed assets in the hundreds of millions. He had climbed Aconcagua and Elbrus on guided trips requiring endurance but no technical skill. The real motivation was specific. 6 months earlier, he had told investors he would summit Everest as a demonstration of the commitment, defining the fund's strategy. The claim appeared in the quarterly newsletter, was discussed at client dinners, and had become inseparable from his professional identity. I've seen climbers driven by ego, by grief, by something to prove to a parent, but this is the first time I've come across someone who turned a summit into a line item on an investor report. The oxygen runs out at the same rate, regardless of why you're there. His Sherpa, Kancha Bhote, was 40 with 9 Everest summits and a reputation for directness. Kancha had assessed Warren during acclimatization and determined he was capable of reaching Camp 4 but lacked the reserves for a summit push. His pace above 24,000 feet was too slow, his oxygen consumption too high. Kancha communicated this to the expedition leader, who communicated it to Warren diplomatically. Warren stated he would manage his effort. The turnaround was set for 10 a.m. By 5:30 a.m., Warren reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, 90 minutes behind schedule. Kancha changed his oxygen bottle and noticed the flow rate had been set to 4 liters per minute, the maximum, rather than the standard rate that would stretch supply for the round trip. Warren had been burning through oxygen unsustainably. Kancha adjusted the flow and told him directly they needed to discuss timing. Warren responded that he felt strong. He felt strong. At 27,600 feet, 90 minutes behind, with half his oxygen already gone. I've learned that "I feel strong" at extreme altitude is one of the most dangerous sentences a climber can say because the feeling has almost no connection to reality. They continued. Traffic on the fixed ropes added further delay. Lines of climbers at varying speeds with limited passing opportunities. Each bottleneck bled minutes, and oxygen Warren could not afford to lose. By 9:45 a.m., still below 28,000 feet, Kancha stopped and told Warren they were turning around. The turnaround was 15 minutes away, the summit at least 2 hours above, and the oxygen insufficient for a safe return. Warren refused. He would continue alone and accept responsibility. Kancha repeated his position once, then stepped aside. He had seen this calculation before. The client would not be moved. Kancha began descending, radioing base camp that the client had separated. Every time I come across a Sherpa stepping aside after being refused, I try to imagine what that walk down feels like. You're descending knowing exactly what's going to happen to the person above you, and there's nothing left you can do about it. Warren continued up the fixed ropes alone, his oxygen critically low after the mismanaged flow rate and a bottle change, time too late. He passed the South Summit area around 1:30 p.m., more than 3 hours past turnaround. He was moving at a pace, suggesting each step required a separate decision. Radio calls from base camp, urging descent, went unanswered. He began descending in afternoon light, his oxygen effectively exhausted, his movements reduced to mechanical shuffling. His body operated on reserves that did not exist, muscles failing, coordination dissolving, each step a negotiation between will and physics that physics was winning. He collapsed above the balcony at approximately 3 p.m., folding beside the fixed rope. Descending climbers through the afternoon checked for signs of life and found shallow breathing that weakened each hour. No one had the oxygen or manpower to move him. Warren Ozzie was found frozen the following morning. He was 44. He never reached the summit. The distance between his highest point and the top was roughly 200 vertical feet. Close enough to see, too far to reach, and completely irrelevant to the mountain that killed him. 200 feet. I kept coming back to that number because it proves how meaningless the summit was. He died for a distance you could walk in 90 seconds at sea level.